In this lesson, we'll look at multiple choice questions and 3 written response questions for A Legend of the Wooden Shoes. And the link to this is in this video description. So we begin our story. We're going to meet our carpenter. But first, we have a long ago in Holland. So this would be our setting, and this would be the Netherlands in Europe. So we know that oak is very important to these people. They're using it for all sorts of things, making bread, making their homes, and people live in the forest. But then, as time goes on, people begin to build cities and towns and clear it for pastures where animals would go, livestock like cows, and replace it with orchards and gardens. In paragraph 3, we meet this certain carpenter, and that would also be his conflict, that he hates that this is happening to his forest. So as he's walking, Van Eyck sees 2 spirits. So remember, as this would be what you call a legend, you could also call this a folktale, a fiction story that would be meaningful to a particular culture or region of the world. And so that's where we have our 2 spirits approaching. And they tell him to go to his ancestral oak, and then they kind of vanish away. So he goes to where his magnificent ancient oak tree that his grandfather and ancestors had allowed no one to cut down. And then basically the tree tells him to stop mourning. Mourning means sadness. And allow them to pass away. And it'll bring his children warmth and comfort and wealth. And then he's told by these, it's going to say, as he started among the moss maiden, they return and tell him to cut these 2 pieces of oak wood about a foot long and put them on his table. So he does this. Then he has a dream where the sprites come in, use these special tools. That would be the hatchet, auger, chisel knife, and a plane. Those would be different types of tools used for carpentry. And he finds a pair of wooden shoes sitting there. And they're smooth, sturdy heels, smart, pointy toes. But they're unsteady on wooden floors, so they'd be unsteady on smooth surfaces. But then when he goes outside, he can walk on them because it's the even soil of the mud. So now he goes to the blacksmith and has all those same tools that he had in his dream made for him. And then the resolution, that would be the ending, he starts this Klappenwinkel store. And also, so these are a type of shoes. They would be called clogs. They kind of are like Crocs, to be honest, but they'd be made of wood. And they're very symbolic to this region. So these are the kind of shoes that he is said to make there. And soon in his family are rich beyond their wildest dreams. Now, this story is a little unique for I guess you could say, a forest or a tree or climate type story, because the trees basically tell him to just kind of go with it. Usually they just want to save the trees, but in this one, that isn't the case. So when we have the main idea, it would be the carpenter mourns the loss of the forest and is guided by tree spirits to create wooden shoes. So this one is going to be answer choice B. He does mourn the loss, but he's still going to create the shoes. So I guess that wouldn't be a central idea. The main idea is going to be basically the shortest summary you could think of for a story or an article. That would be what you would refer to as the main idea. Why does the carpenter follow instructions of the moss maiden? We would want to see for this one he is curious. And somebody had said in another class that I had that he was scared. We probably would have been scared if we saw it. This happened to us, right? But considering it's from his point of view, and it says he knew exactly what tree they meant, he doesn't say anything here about being scared. So we would have to go with answer choice B, curious. And then we have the word mourned. So of course you want to go back to paragraph 3, celebrated joyfully, felt deep sadness, worked tirelessly, searched carefully. And if we go back up to paragraph 3, it's going to say he bitterly mourned the loss of his beloved forest. So we know here bitterly means like a lot and kind of angry about it too. But mourned would just mean deep sadness. So that would be for this answer. We would have felt deep sadness, B. What evidence from the story shows that the wooden shoes were practical? Now here you have to know what the word practical means. So basically, if you were going to go on a hike, it wouldn't be practical to wear flip-flops. You would want to wear hiking boots. But if you were going to go to the beach, it wouldn't be practical to wear hiking boots. You would want to wear flip-flops because you're going to go in the water and then you're going to go swimming and stuff and it'd probably be hot. So you wouldn't want big giant boots on. And then your boots would get all sandy. So practical, it doesn't necessarily mean good or bad. It just means good for a specific situation. So smelling of oak doesn't really have anything to do with like practicality, right? They were unsteady on the wooden kitchen floor. Now, you could say they're not practical house shoes for sure, but C, they were light, easy to walk on, and kept out of water better than leather shoes. So C, that would be our practical. To go walking around places, it's better to wear these clogs, you could say. And then the one about how they were carved, that doesn't have to do with practicality or being practical. So for this one, it has to be C. What theme does the story convey about change and tradition? Change should be avoided to preserve traditions. Accepting change can lead to new opportunities while honoring traditions. Traditions are more important than wealth and success. Change always destroys the value of nature. Now, it can't be C because in the end, he did become wealthy. So that one wouldn't really make sense to be a theme, right? A theme is like a lesson. So if the lesson was, this would be like a lesson if he said, if he got all these trees to stay and he like protected them somehow, then it might be the lesson, right? But that's not what happened. Change should be avoided. He definitely didn't avoid change. He's going to start using these trees, right? Accepting change can lead to new opportunities while honoring traditions. It's going to have to be B here because he accepted the change. And you could say he's honoring traditions by using his wood and using the trees for these practical shoes that everybody's kind of going to like. So he uses these oak trees in a new way. He probably didn't chop all of them down, right? So they're not going to be all go extinct because he's making these clogs. But you could say he's still honoring the tradition of the tree by making shoes out of wood because really this region of the world was known for that, making these wooden shoes. So that's what you have, honoring the traditions. Now we would have our questions. What does paragraph 3, how does paragraph 3 fit into the structure of excerpt from Legend Shoes? Legend of Wooden Shoes. So now, structure basically means how your story was built, okay? So when you're talking about structure, you could actually be talking about the exposition. Those would be those first 3 paragraphs. The rising action, those are going to be all the events that happen where he meets the sprites, where he has the dream. Well, actually, up until when he comes across the wooden shoes, that's, you could say, the climax. When the elves make his shoes and he sees them, and then the falling action, you could say, the carpenter sees the shoes and goes to a blacksmith to make the tools needed to create more shoes, right? More wooden shoes. And then he starts a store, right? He then starts selling them. And then you could have the resolution. He makes it a full-on business and him and his family become rich. That's your resolution there. So talking about the structure of a story, you can talk about these elements of the plot, the 5 parts of a plot. That's what we would call this. And this would be your plot diagram here. Exposition, the way it starts. Rising action, the series of conflicts and crisis in the story that lead to the climax. The turning point, the most intense moment. Falling action, all the events that follow the climax. Resolution, the conclusion, or the tying the events together. Kind of like, how do all these people end up in the end? How we kind of think of them when the story's over. You could say that's also the resolution. So for this, we could say Paragraph 3 fits into the structure of the story because it introduces a main character who is a carpenter that really loves oak trees. This develops the story's conflict because he didn't want anyone to cut down the oak trees. By the end of the story, he overcomes his conflict. I could even say introduced in paragraph 3. And of protecting the trees, I would put this here. I'm going to put I put the commas here because technically I could take this out and my sentence would still read fine. I'm just adding this kind of, so the test makers know we're kind of going back to our paragraph 3 again. Of protecting the trees by making wooden shoes to use the trees to help himself and family. So you could finish this with like a closing sentence. Paragraph 3 introduced the story's protagonist and his conflict, which would be your exposition. I could say paragraph 3 was the exposition of the story because it introduced the story's protagonist and his conflict. And we know that's what's done in the exposition. But if you didn't remember that, that's okay. You don't have to, as long as you said something about it introduced the main character, you could say it introduced his problem or conflict. It showed why the main character was upset. Something about how it showed something about our main character and what his problem was. And if you could say the exposition, which then led shows us how he's going to solve his conflict, right? All right, then the next question here is going to ask us in paragraph 8, how does the power of the old oak tree support a theme of the story? All right, so here we're going to have the carpenter knew exactly which tree they meant. There was a magnificent ancient oak deep in the forest that his father, his grandfather, and all his ancestors had loved and allowed no one to cut down. When he stood beneath its spreading branches, the leaves overhead began to rustle. The sound shaped itself into words. You must stop mourning, the tree told him. I and my fellow oak trees must pass away, but in time we return and furnish your children and your children's children with warmth, comfort, and wealth. So for this one, you would have to identify the theme. So when you get questions about themes, you kind of have to come up with a theme for your response. So we could say we want to reword our question, right? Reword your question into your answer. So it could start your sentence. So we could say paragraph 8. We could say, or you don't have to say paragraph 8. We could say the power of the old oak tree supports a theme of the story because we could say it shows the carpenter that he must change and we could say he must change, we could say that change does not always have to be a bad thing. So there we could say that's our theme, that change isn't always bad. Or we could say something like change doesn't have to hurt nature. Or you could also say like sometimes you need permission to stop feeling bad about something, because he kept feeling bad about the trees and then the tree told him not to feel bad, so then he didn't anymore. Something about change, overcoming, not to be stuck in your old ways, that could be another one, but we'll use this one. So we have the power of the old oak tree supports the theme of the story because it shows a carpenter that change does not always have to be a bad thing. And then now I would use my evidence. So we could say at the start of the story, the carpenter was very angry that people were cutting down his ancestral trees for, we could say, industrial development. That just means building stuff like homes and businesses and all those kinds of things. That would be kind of a wordy one. If you didn't remember that, okay. So then we could say, he then visits a powerful oak tree. I could say magic. Visits a magic oak tree that tells him it is okay to um, to cut down the trees in order to make a living, because that's basically what he does. So we could say, this supports the theme of the story because the carpenter uses, we could say honors the oak trees by making a product that people love, which in turn makes his family very wealthy. And that's what the tree told him too. The tree wanted him to use their oak to make these shoes and become very wealthy. So you could say something too about honoring one's home can bring great wealth, because he did, this is a cultural story and it's like a cultural significance. And then we have, how does the carpenter's point of view change throughout the story? Point of view just means all they want to know when they ask you about point of view is what is the character's thoughts and feelings. So we could say the point of view of the carpenter changes from mournful in the beginning to happy in the resolution. And resolution just means the ending. I could also use the phrase here, exposition. Okay, but if you can remember that, so in the exposition to happy in the resolution or ending, and I'll put that there so you remember. So then we could say, I want to use some textual evidence here. And I could say at the start of the story, the carpenter, what could we say? The carpenter, we know how sad you are. There. Oops. I could say here. Oops, wait. I want to say, we could say the carpenter comes across two creatures, and the elf says, I know how sad you are. And that would be para. We'll put our paragraph there. Where we know how sad you are. Para 6. So I gotta use direct quote. And the elf says, we know how sad you are. Paragraph 6. And then, wait, creatures. And the elf says, we know how sad you are. The carpenter is then told by a great oak tree that he should no longer mourn the loss of the forest, but rather use it as an opportunity to find a new way of life, because he was kind of living off the trees in the forest. So we could say that the oak tree also kind of told him, like, you got to find other ways to make money if this is happening to your forest. You have to, find new livelihoods or new opportunities where you can. So then we can say, after the sprites make the carpenter a pair of wooden shoes, he is very excited and goes to get the tools made for himself from a blacksmith. By the end of the story, the carpenter's, I'm going to say, point of view changes to a positive one because he starts a lucrative shoe business for his family. And lucrative just means it makes money. So that could be how you would answer a question like this. And you could say, as long as you have something, point of view means feelings or emotions. So you would have something about him being sad at the beginning, and then happy, excited, hopeful, optimistic, however you wanted to say how he is in the end. Sad, depressed, anxious, well, not so much anxious, but definitely sad, depressed, mournful in the beginning. And then by the end, happy. You could have how he was excited in the middle, or the rising action and climax falling action, but definitely you would want to say something about him being happy. And those would be our 3 written response questions for A Legend of the Wooden Shoes.